Lesson 14. The Louisiana Purchase and Expedition of Lewis Clark and Zebulon Pike. Timeline connection. As the year 1803 dawned, President Thomas Jefferson sat in his study at the President's house in Washington, D.C., wrestling with a problem that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. The young United States, barely 27 years old, was like a teenager who had suddenly grown too big for his clothes. The 13 original states were bursting with people who dreamed of moving west to find new land, new opportunities, and new lives. But between these ambitious Americans and their Western dreams lie an enormous obstacle: the vast Louisiana territory, controlled by the powerful French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Jefferson knew that if France established a strong presence in North America, it could spell disaster for the young republic. The French were not like the Spanish, who had been content to govern their territories from a distance. Napoleon was ambitious, energetic, and had already conquered much of Europe. The thought of having such a formidable neighbor controlling the mouth of the Mississippi River, the great highway that carried American goods to market, kept Jefferson awake at night. But God, in His perfect timing, was about to provide a solution that would exceed Jefferson's wildest dreams and set the stage for America to become a continental nation. A side note is this is where my dad was born, in Louisiana. Okay, back to key dates. 1803, the Louisiana Purchase was completed. In 1804 through 1806, Lewis and Clark expedition. And then 1806 through 1807, Pike's Western expedition. A deal too good to believe. Picture Thomas Jefferson on a warm July morning in 1803, standing in the same study where he had written the Declaration of Independence 27 years earlier. A messenger has just arrived with news so extraordinary that Jefferson can hardly believe it. The United States has not only purchased the port city of New Orleans, which was all Jefferson had dared to hope for, but has acquired the entire Louisiana territory, an area so vast that it doubles the size of the nation overnight. Wow. The story of how this miracle came to pass reads like an adventure novel written by the hand of Providence itself. Jefferson had originally sent his friend James Monroe to Paris with instructions to offer up to $10 million for the city of New Orleans and perhaps part of Florida. The president knew that American farmers and merchants desperately needed access to the Mississippi River and its mouth at New Orleans to ship their goods to market. Without this access, the Western territories might even consider breaking away from the United States to make their own deals with foreign powers. But when Monroe arrived in Paris in April 19 no, excuse me. But when Monroe arrived in Paris in April 1803, he discovered that Napoleon had much bigger plans than anyone had imagined. The French emperor, who had dreamed of rebuilding France's empire in North America, had run into problems that seemed insurmountable. His army sent to crush a slave rebellion in the sugar-rich island of Haiti had been devastated by enemy bullets, but okay, let's go back. His army sent to crush a slave rebellion in the sugar-rich island of Haiti had been devastated not by enemy bullets, but by yellow fever, a disease that killed soldiers faster than they could be replaced. Meanwhile, Napoleon could see that war with Britain was coming again, and he knew that the British Navy would likely capture Louisiana the moment hostilities began. Napoleon's finance minister, a practical man named Francisco di Barbosi, had been telling the emperor for months that Louisiana was more trouble than it's worth. Why not sell the entire territory to the Americans, he suggested. We need money for the war in Europe, and the Americans will pay well for land. Napoleon, who was nothing if not decisive, agreed. On April 11th, 1803, the French foreign minister shocked the American negotiators by offering to sell not just New Orleans, but all of Louisiana. 827,000 square miles of territory for $15 million. Monroe and Robert Livingston, the American minister to France, could hardly believe their ears. They were being offered an area larger than all of Europe for less than 4 cents an acre. Wow. They knew they were exceeding their authority. They had been told to spend no more than $10 million, and only for New Orleans and Florida. But they also knew that this was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance that might never come again. On April 30th, 1803, they signed the treaty that would transform America forever. When news of the purchase reached America, it created a sensation. Some people were thrilled, imagining the vast new lands that would be open for settlement. Others were worried about the cost. $15 million was an enormous sum for a young nation that was still paying off its debts from the Revolutionary War. A few politicians even argued that the Constitution didn't give the federal government the power to buy new territory. Jefferson himself had doubts about the constitutional question. He believed strongly that the federal government should only exercise powers specifically granted by the Constitution. And nowhere did that document mention buying land from foreign countries. For a while, he considered proposing a constitutional amendment to make the purchase legal. But his advisors convinced him that there wasn't time. Napoleon might change his mind if they delayed too long. Finally, Jefferson decided that the purchase was like a guardian buying property for his ward. I did this for your good, he would tell future generations of Americans. Lewis and Clark, into the unknown. Even before the Louisiana Purchase was completed, Jefferson had been planning something that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. An expedition to explore the vast unknown lands west of the Mississippi River. In January 1803, he had secretly asked Congress for money to fund an expedition that would cross the Louisiana Territory, regardless of who controlled it, and continue all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Jefferson chose his personal secretary, a young Army captain named Meriwether Lewis, to lead this incredible journey. Lewis was the perfect choice for such a mission. He was intelligent, brave, and had grown up on the Virginia frontier, where he had learned to hunt, track, and survive in the wilderness. But Lewis knew he would need help leading such an important expedition, so he asked his old Army friend William Clark to join him as co-commander. Clark was 4 years older than Lewis and had more experience leading men in difficult situations. He was also an excellent map reader and maker, and had a natural gift for getting along with people, a skill that would prove invaluable when dealing with the many Native American tribes they would encounter. Together, Lewis and Clark made a perfect team. Lewis was the scientist and naturalist, while Clark was the practical leader and diplomat. The goals Jefferson set for the expedition were ambitious, almost beyond belief. He wanted Lewis and Clark to find a water route across the continent to the Pacific Ocean, a northwest passage. That would make trade with Asia much easier and more profitable. He wanted them to map the new territory, study its plants and animals, and record everything they saw. Most importantly, he wanted them to establish peaceful relationships with the Native American tribes they encountered, letting them know that they now had a new great father in Washington. On May 14, 1804, the Corps of Discovery, as the expedition came to be called, set out from St. Louis with about 45 men, including soldiers, hunters, interpreters, and Clark's African-American slave York, who would prove to be one of the most popular members of the expedition among the Native Americans they met. They traveled in a 55-foot Neo boat and two smaller boats called pirogues, loaded with supplies, gifts for Native Americans, and scientific instruments. The journey that followed was one of the greatest adventures in American history. For 862 days, the expedition traveled through lands that no American had ever seen, across prairies that stretched to the horizon, over mountains that seemed to touch the sky, and down rivers that had never appeared on any map. Ooh, that sounds adventurous. They encountered grizzly bears that were larger and more dangerous than any animal they had ever imagined. They met Native American tribes who had never seen white men before and who were amazed by York's dark skin and Clark's red hair. One of the most important people they met was a young Shoshan woman named Sakawaka, who joined the expedition as an interpreter and guide. Sakawaka, who was only about 16 years old and carrying a baby on her back, proved to be invaluable to the expedition's success. She helped them find food when supplies ran low, guided them through treacherous mountain passes, and served as a living symbol of peace. Native American war parties knew that no war party would travel with a woman and baby. The expedition faced challenges that would have defeated lesser men. They nearly starved crossing the Rocky Mountains, where early snow blocked the passes and game was scarce. They had to carry their boats around enormous waterfalls and navigate rapids that threatened to dash them against the rocks. They endured bitter cold, scorching heat, clouds of mosquitoes, and the constant threat of attack by hostile tribes or dangerous animals. But they also experienced wonders that filled them with awe. They saw herds of buffalo so vast that they covered the prairie from horizon to horizon. They discovered plants and animals that no scientist had ever described. They met Native American peoples whose cultures were as rich and complex as any in the world. And on November 7th, 1805, after traveling more than 4,000 miles, they finally reached their goal when Clark wrote in his journal, "Ocean in view, oh the joy." The expedition spent the winter near the The expedition spent the winter near the mouth of the Columbia River in a fort they built and named Fort Gladstone. Then in March of 1806, they began the long journey home, arriving in St. Louis on September 23, 1806, to a hero's welcome. They had been gone so long that many people had given up them to be dead. The Lewis and Clark expedition was a triumph that succeeded even Jefferson's high expectations. They had not found the Northwest Passage, no such water route existed. But they had accomplished something even more valuable. They had mapped a route to the Pacific, established American claims to the Oregon Territory, and brought back detailed information about the geography, plants, animals, and peoples of the West. Most important, they had proven that Americans could accomplish anything they set their minds to, no matter how difficult or dangerous. Pike's expedition exploring the southern route. While Lewis and Clark were making their way to the Pacific, another young Army officer was leading expeditions that would add to America's knowledge of its new western territories. Zebulon Montgomery Pike was only 26 years old when he was chosen to lead the first official American exploration of the West Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. Pike was a different sort of explorer than Lewis and Clark, where they were careful scientists who took detailed notes about everything they saw. Pike was more of a soldier and an adventurer who was primarily interested in military political information. His expeditions were smaller and less well equipped than the Corps of Discovery, but they were no less important in opening up the American West. Pike's first expedition in 1805 was to find the source of the Mississippi River. This might not sound very exciting, but it was actually quite important. The United States needed to know exactly where its northern border was, and the source of the Mississippi would help determine the boundary with British Canada. Pike and his small party traveled up the frozen Mississippi in the middle of the winter, enduring temperatures so cold their whiskey froze solid. Although Pike thought he had found the true source of the great river, he is actually about 100 miles short of the real source. But his expedition provided valuable information about the northern territories and helped establish American presence in the region. Pike's second expedition, which began in July 1806, was far more ambitious and dangerous. He was ordered to explore the Arkansas and Red Rivers to make contact with Native American tribes in the region and to gather information about Spanish activities in the Southwest. What Pike didn't know was that his commanding officer, General James Wilkinson, was secretly working for the Spanish government and may have deliberately sent Pike into Spanish territory hoping he would be captured. Pike and his party of 22 men traveled west across the Great Plains, marveling at the vast herds of buffalo and the seemingly endless grasslands. In November 1806, they spotted a distant mountain peak that Pike tried unsuccessfully to climb. This peak, which Pike described as a small blue cloud, would later be named Pike's Peak in his honor and would become famous during the Colorado Gold Rush, when prospectors adopted the slogan, "Pike's Peak or Bust." As winter set in, Pike's expedition found itself in increasingly difficult circumstances. They were traveling through territory that was claimed by Spain, and they were running low on supplies. In February 1807, Spanish soldiers found Pike and his men building a fort on the Rio Grande River and arrested them for illegally entering Spanish territory. Pike insisted that he was lost and had accidentally crossed into Spanish territory, but the Spanish weren't convinced. They marched Pike and his men south to Santa Fe, then to Chichichana, Mexico, where Pike was questioned by Spanish officials who wanted to know what the Americans were really doing in their territory. Pike was treated well during his captivity, more like a guest than a prisoner, but he was also carefully watched. During his time in Spanish custody, Pike was able to observe Spanish military strength, trade routes, and political conditions. Information that would prove valuable to the American government. He also learned about the wealth of Spanish territories and the opportunities for trade that might exist if relations between the two countries improved. After several months, the Spanish decided to release Pike and his men. They escorted them to the Louisiana border and set them free in July 1807. Pike returned to the United States with valuable information about the Southwest and with stories of Spanish weakness that would influence American policy for years to come. The meaning of the expeditions. The Louisiana Purchase and the expeditions of Lewis and Clark and Zebulon Pike marked a turning point in American history. In just a few short years, the United States had doubled in size and had begun the process of exploring and claiming the vast territories that would eventually stretch from sea to shining sea. These events showed the world that America was no longer just a collection of small states clinging to the Atlantic coast. It was becoming a continental nation with unlimited potential for growth and expansion. The purchase also demonstrated that the young republic could act decisively when opportunities arose, and that it had leaders who were willing to take bold risks for the good of the country. But perhaps most importantly, these expeditions revealed the character of the American people. Lewis and Clark and their men showed that Americans were willing to venture into the unknown territories to face incredible hardships and to persevere in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. They demonstrated the spirit of adventure, curiosity, and determination that would drive American expansion for the next century. The Native American peoples they encountered would soon face enormous changes as American settlers followed the trails blazed by these early explorers. The buffalo herds that had covered the plains for thousands of years would be hunted nearly to extinction. The vast wilderness that had seemed so empty to American eyes was actually home to dozens of Native American nations who would be forced to adapt to a rapidly changing world. But in 1803, as Jefferson signed the treaty that made the Louisiana Purchase official, and in 1804, as Lewis and Clark pushed their boats into the Missouri River current, the future seemed bright with promise. America had taken its first great step toward becoming the continental nation that Jefferson had always envisioned. The stage was set for the great westward movement that would define the next chapter of American history. Looking ahead, as Lewis and Clark made their way back to St. Louis in the autumn of 1806, carrying with them maps, specimens, and stories that would fire the imagination of a generation, other events were unfolding across the Atlantic Ocean that would soon demand America's attention. In Britain, a member of Parliament named William Wilberforce was waging a different kind of battle. not against the wilderness of foreign powers, but against one of the greatest evils of his age, the slave trade that had brought misery to millions of Africans and shame to the Christian nation that would participate in it. Wilberforce's fight would show that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with guns and expeditions, but with persistence, faith, and unwavering commitment to what is right.